My grandmother left her house to the child who never left. My cousins were certain it was them. My name is Wren Calloway, and I am 34 years old. 14 months ago, my grandmother Rose sat in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and told her attorney exactly what she wanted done with her house. She had already decided. She had decided years before that Tuesday, actually, but she had been waiting, with the particular patience of a woman who had lived 81 years and understood that some things needed time to become undeniable before they could be put in writing. The house was a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Mineral Springs, North Carolina, that my great-grandfather had built in 1951. Rose had lived in it for 60 years. She had raised 4 children in it. She had buried a husband from it. She had canned tomatoes in its kitchen and planted dahlias along its south-facing fence and repainted its front porch every 4 years without fail because she believed a house that was cared for cared back. She left it to the child who never left. That phrase, the child who never left, appeared in the will exactly once, as the description of the beneficiary, followed by a name. Her attorney had tried to get her to simply write the name without the phrase. Rose had declined. She said the phrase was the explanation, and the explanation was the point. And if people wanted to understand the decision, the explanation needed to be there. The name she wrote after the phrase was mine. What happened in the weeks after the will was read, in a house full of cousins who had each spent years believing they were the obvious choice, is the part of this story I want to tell you. But to tell it properly, I need to take you back to what never left actually meant in our family, and why every single one of my cousins was certain it referred to them. Before I go further, please like and subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to Mineral Springs and to a family that loved the same woman in very different ways. And to what Rose saw when she looked at all of us. My grandmother had 4 children. My mother Diane was the eldest, followed by Uncle Perry, Aunt Claudette, and the youngest, Uncle Marsh, who was 12 years younger than my mother and had always existed in a slightly different generation than his siblings. Each of them had children. I was Diane's only child. Perry had 2 sons, Marcus and Joel. Claudette had a daughter named Simone. Marsh had 3 children, twins named Bo and Cora, and a younger daughter named Petra. 7 grandchildren total. 7 people who had grown up in and around that Craftsman house, who had slept in its bedrooms and eaten at its kitchen table and spent summers on its porch watching Rose's dahlias come back every year like they had an appointment. 7 people who each believed in some version of their own understanding of themselves that they were the one who had loved Rose best. I want to be fair to my cousins, because fairness matters, and because this story is not about villains. Marcus had lived in Mineral Springs for most of his adult life, within 20 minutes of Rose's house, and had driven her to doctor's appointments for years. Joel had called her every Sunday without fail for the last decade. Simone had spent 3 summers in her 20s living with Rose after a difficult divorce, and they had developed a closeness during those years that Simone spoke about openly and often. Bo had fixed Rose's roof after a storm 2 years before she died, driving 8 hours from Tennessee to do it. Cora had organized a family reunion at the house 4 years earlier that Rose had described as the best day she'd had in years. Petra, the youngest, had been Rose's shadow during childhood summers, following her through the garden and the kitchen with the particular devotion of the youngest grandchild. Every single one of them had a story. Every single one of those stories was true. My story was different and quieter, and I had never told it to anyone because Rose had asked me not to. I grew up in Asheville, 2 hours from Mineral Springs, which was close enough that visits were regular, but far enough that I was not the grandchild who lived nearby. My mother Diane worked long hours as a hospital administrator and traveled frequently for her work, which meant that during school holidays and summer breaks, I was often in Mineral Springs with Rose. Not visiting, living. There is a difference, and it is the difference Rose meant when she wrote the phrase she chose. From the time I was 7 until I was 17, I spent a minimum of 6 weeks per year in that house, not always consecutively. Sometimes in 2-week stretches at spring break and summer, sometimes longer. When my mother's work took her to extended assignments, and my father, who had been absent since I was 4, was unavailable, which was always, Rose was who I went to. She never made it feel like an imposition. That was the first thing I understood about Rose, the thing that took me years to recognize as rare. She never once, in all those years, made me feel like I was being accommodated. She made me feel like I was where I was supposed to be. She taught me to cook in that kitchen. Not recipes exactly, methods. The way you learn when someone shows you how a thing works rather than just how to follow instructions. She taught me to read the garden, to know which plants needed water by looking at the leaves rather than by following a schedule. She taught me to repaint a porch correctly, with primer first and 2 coats after, because she said 1 coat was just optimism. She also told me things about her own life, her own history, her marriage to my grandfather, who had died before I was born, her children, and who they had grown into. She told me these things not as gossip, but as context, the way a person shares their understanding of their own world with someone they trust to hold it carefully. I held it carefully. I never repeated it. When cousins asked what Rose and I talked about during those summers, I said everything and nothing, which was true, and which satisfied nobody, but which was all I had to offer. When I was 17, I moved in with Rose for a year. This is the part of the story that none of my cousins knew. My mother had accepted a 2-year placement in another state. My father was not a realistic option. Rose offered her house without hesitation or condition, and I finished my junior and senior years of high school in Mineral Springs, living in the same bedroom I had slept in every summer since I was 7. I went to the local high school. I helped Rose with the house and the garden and the increasingly complicated paperwork that came with being an elderly person navigating a healthcare system that was not designed to be navigated alone. I drove her to appointments before I had a license, on quiet roads where there was no traffic, because she had taught me to drive in the driveway when I was 15 and said she trusted me more than she trusted most licensed drivers she knew. I graduated from Mineral Springs High School. My mother flew in for the ceremony. Rose sat in the second row in a blue dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and cried during the processional, which she later denied. I went to college in Chapel Hill. I came back for every holiday, every break, every long weekend I could manage, because Mineral Springs was the place that felt most like home, and Rose was the person who had made it feel that way. I want to be careful here because I think it would be easy to make this sound like a campaign. Like I was accumulating presents in order to accumulate inheritance. I was not. I never thought about the house. I thought about Rose. I came back because I wanted to see her, because she was the person in my family who knew me most completely, because the Craftsman on Mineral Springs Road with its dahlia fence and its freshly painted porch was where I knew how to breathe. She asked me once, when I was in my late 20s, whether I had ever thought about where I wanted to end up. I told her I had thought about it, and that I kept coming back to the same answer without being entirely sure it was realistic. She asked what the answer was. I said I'd like to stay near her. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you should know that I've already made arrangements for that to be possible." I asked what she meant. She said, "Nothing you need to worry about yet. I just wanted you to know that you have somewhere to land." I did not ask further. Rose said what she meant to say and no more. And if she said it was nothing to worry about yet, then it was nothing to worry about yet. I filed it somewhere quiet and went back to helping her repot her dahlias. Rose died in October on a morning that started like any other morning in that house. Coffee at 6:30, the radio playing low, the particular quality of October light through the kitchen windows. I was there. I had come for the week because her health had been uncertain for a month, and I had rearranged my work schedule without being asked and without announcing it as a sacrifice because it was not a sacrifice. It was where I needed to be. Her passing was quiet. Everything about Rose had been quiet, in the way that strength can be quiet when it has nothing left to prove. The funeral was in Mineral Springs, at the church she had attended for 50 years. Every grandchild came, some I had not seen in years. We stood together in the particular way that families stand at funerals, and said the things that families say, and ate the food that the church ladies brought, and told the stories about Rose that we each carried. I noticed, during those days, that several cousins were already discussing the house. Not crassly, not openly. Obliquely, the way people discuss things they are thinking about but have not yet given themselves permission to think about directly. Marcus mentioned that the house would need upkeep. Simone said she had always thought it was the kind of place that should stay in the family. Cora said Rose had told her, at the reunion, that she hoped the house would be loved the way it deserved. I said nothing. I helped carry plates and fold tablecloths and sat with Rose's oldest friend Nadine for an hour because Nadine was 93 and had known Rose since they were girls and needed someone to sit with her. The will reading was 2 weeks later. Rose's attorney, a steady woman named Patricia Gaines, who had been handling Rose's affairs for 15 years, gathered us in the living room of the Craftsman house. All 7 grandchildren, the 4 surviving children, and 2 of Rose's oldest friends, including Nadine, who had insisted on attending and whom nobody had the heart to exclude. Patricia read the will clearly and without drama, the way good attorneys read things. The household contents were divided thoughtfully, specific items to specific people, with notes Rose had written herself explaining why each item was going where it was going. My mother received the kitchen table. Uncle Marsh received my grandfather's tools. Simone received a quilt Rose had made the summer they spent together. Each grandchild received something chosen for them specifically, which was so perfectly Rose that half the room was already crying before the house itself was mentioned. Then Patricia read the phrase, "The house and the property at 14 Mineral Springs Road, Mineral Springs, North Carolina, I leave to the child who never left." She paused. The room was very still, and then she said my name. I want to describe what happened in that room carefully, because I think the details matter. Marcus looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. Joel looked at the floor. Simone's face went through several things in quick succession, ending somewhere that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. Bo looked at Cora. Cora looked at me. Petra, who was 26 and had always been the most openly emotional of the cousins, started crying immediately, which could have meant anything. My mother reached over and took my hand. My Uncle Perry said quietly, "Wren, that was all. Just my name." But the way he said it told me he had known or suspected or understood something the others hadn't, because Perry was the sibling who had always paid closest attention to what Rose actually did rather than what she said. Afterward, in the kitchen, the cousins gathered in the way that people gather when they need to process something collectively. I stayed in the living room with Nadine, who patted my hand and said, "She talked about you all the time. You know that, don't you?" I told her I hadn't known that exactly. "Every time I saw her," Nadine said, "Wren did this, Wren said that. You were her person." She squeezed my hand. "Don't let anyone make you feel like that isn't enough reason." From the kitchen, I could hear the cousins talking, not arguing. They were not that kind of family, not openly, but the conversation had a particular texture, the kind that comes when people are trying to understand something that doesn't match their version of events. Simone came to find me. She was composed in the way that takes effort to maintain. "I didn't know you two were that close," she said. I told her we had always been close. "She never mentioned—" Simone stopped. "She never told me you lived with her." I said it hadn't seemed like something to mention. "For a year," Simone said. "Yes," I said. "For a year." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I lived with her for 3 summers." "I know," I said. "She loved those summers. She talked about them." Simone's expression shifted slightly. "She talked about them to you?" "She talked about everything to me," I said. "That's what we did." That seemed to land differently than I expected. Simone looked at the doorway to the kitchen for a moment, then back at me. Something in her face was doing the kind of recalculating that happens when a story you've been telling yourself turns out to have details in it you didn't know about. "She chose well," Simone said finally. Not warmly, not yet, but honestly. And honesty, in that moment, was the thing I needed most from her. Marcus was harder. He had lived nearest, had driven Rose to appointments for years, had built his proximity into an identity. He came to me 2 days after the will reading at the house, my house now, though I could barely hold that thought without it feeling presumptuous, and said that he felt Rose had made a decision without fully understanding what it would mean for the family. I asked him what he thought it would mean. He said it would create distance, that some of the cousins would feel excluded from a place that had always been shared. I told him the house had never been shared in the way he meant. It had been Rose's. She had simply allowed all of us to love it while it was hers. Now it was mine, and I intended to allow the same. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "She called me last year," he said. "A few months before she got sick, she asked me a question." He paused. "She asked me if I knew what you had given up to finish high school in Mineral Springs instead of Asheville. I said I hadn't given anything up. That's what I told her," he said, "that it probably hadn't been that hard, given how close you were." He looked at the porch railing, the one I had helped Rose repaint 3 years earlier. She said that was what she thought I thought, and then she changed the subject. We stood there for a while in silence. "She was making sure," he said finally, "checking who understood and who didn't." "Yes," I said. "That sounds like her." Marcus nodded slowly. Then he asked if he could still come to visit, not with any claim in the request, just as a question, genuinely. I told him the porch would always have a chair for him. He exhaled. Some of the stiffness went out of his shoulders. The conversation I think about most happened with Petra, the youngest cousin, the one who had cried immediately at the will reading. She came to see me a week after, on a Thursday evening, and sat on the porch with me while the October light did what October light does in North Carolina. Went golden, and then amber, and then the particular purple that happens just before dark. She said she had been thinking about the phrase, "the child who never left." I asked what she'd been thinking. "I always thought it meant geography," she said, "like who stayed closest, who visited most." She picked at the edge of her sleeve. "But that's not what she meant, is it?" I asked what she thought Rose had meant. Petra was quiet for a moment. "She meant who never left her," she said. "Like, emotionally. Who was always there in the way that actually counts." She looked at the dahlia bed along the fence, still blooming in October, the way Rose's dahlias always seem to bloom longer than they should. She meant who showed up when nobody was watching. "Yes," I said. "I think that's right." Petra nodded slowly. "I didn't do that," she said, not with bitterness, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone taking an accurate accounting of themselves. "I loved her, but I showed up when it was easy. You showed up when it wasn't." I told her that wasn't entirely fair to herself. She had been young during most of those years, and nobody had asked her to do more than she did. "Nobody asked you either," she said. That was true. We sat on the porch until it was fully dark. She asked about the house, what I planned to do with it, whether I would live in it. I told her I had been thinking about that I was considering moving to Mineral Springs, that the house felt like it wanted to be lived in, not just maintained, and that I was the person Rose had trusted to live in it. Petra smiled. "She'd like that," she said. "She'd really like that." I moved to Mineral Springs 4 months after Rose died. I took a remote position with my firm that let me stay. I repainted the front porch in the spring, with primer first and 2 coats after, the way Rose had taught me, because 1 coat is just optimism. The dahlias came back in June, exactly on schedule, as though they had an appointment. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them open and thought about everything that had been built in this house. Not just the structure, though the structure was solid and the Craftsman bones were as good as they had always been, but the other things. The methods learned in the kitchen. The garden read by leaf rather than schedule. The long summers and the school year and the Saturday drives to doctor's appointments and the porch painted every 4 years and the 2 strong coffee at 6:30 in the morning. The things that don't get documented. The things that just happen quietly between 2 people who have decided to show up for each other without making it an announcement. I host the family gatherings now. Not every year, but when they happen here. Marcus came in July with his family and sat on the porch for an afternoon and did not try to reclaim anything, just sat and drank iced tea and talked about Rose the way you talk about someone when the grief has softened enough to become just love. Simone came in August and asked if she could have the recipe for the tomato jam Rose used to make. I found it in the recipe box, on a card in Rose's handwriting, and made a copy for her. We sat at the kitchen table while I wrote it out, and she asked questions about the summers I had spent here, and I answered them. And she listened the way she hadn't quite been able to listen at the will reading. Petra calls every few weeks. She called in September to ask how the dahlias were doing. I sent her a photograph. She sent back 3 crying emojis, and then, a minute later, a message that said she knew what she was doing. She always knew. Yes, I wrote back, she always did. Here's what I want to tell you, because I think it's the part of this story that matters more than the house or the phrase or the cousins, who each had a reason to believe they were the obvious choice. The child who never left was not a geographic description. It was not about proximity or frequency or who had the best story to tell about themselves at the kitchen table. It was about a specific quality of presence that my grandmother had spent 81 years learning to recognize. The presence that shows up without being asked, that stays without making it a sacrifice, that loves without requiring the love to be witnessed in order to be real. Rose had seen that in me. Not because I was better than my cousins or more deserving or had tried harder in some competitive sense. Because I had been, from the time I was 7 years old, simply there. Not performing being there, just there. The house is still standing, the porch is freshly painted, the dahlias come back every year, and somewhere, in the definition of the phrase she chose, my grandmother left me the most important thing she had to give, not the house itself, but the confirmation that the kind of love that doesn't announce itself is still seen, eventually, by the people who know how to look. If someone in your life saw you clearly when nobody else was looking, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who shows up quietly, who loves without making it a performance, who has never quite been told that the kind of presence they offer is the rarest kind there is. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you in the next one.